It is good to see all of you. Welcome to our Chapter 55 Quality School Task Force meeting. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tristan to do roll call, and then we will begin our meeting. Thanks, Tristan.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I always like to ask like a quick little question. Since we had a long weekend, let's share what we did over the nice long weekend. I'll go first. I hung out with my pup. We went to the dog park while it was still warm on Saturday, and then hid away as it got colder over the weekend. And then, let's see, first on my list is Billy.
Hi, everyone. This weekend was district basketball tournament. So I was in Butte watching our Harrison Wildcats.
Nice. Thanks, Billy. Next is Daniel.
Good morning, everybody. I spent the weekend on Georgetown Lake ice fishing.
That does sound nice. All right. Looks like Emily Dean is next.
Good morning. I spent my weekend working, actually, but really hoping for an actual 3-day weekend in the next couple weeks.
Oh, good, good. We all deserve the break. Thanks for working hard, Emily. Okay, looks like David Pafford is next.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? I didn't get a chance for a sound check.
We can hear you.
Okay, this weekend I rode around the property on some snowmobiles with the kinfolk until the NASCAR race came on.
That does sound nice. Glad you have fun. Let's see. After David, got Gail.
I did some deep cleaning.
Spring cleaning's almost here. Let's see, Heather Jarrett.
Good morning, everybody. I also spent this weekend at our district basketball tournament in Red Lodge.
Wonderful. Janelle Beers.
Good morning. I spent part of the weekend getting ready for company and having company, and they left this morning. So now back to doing a little more cleaning.
We all know how that goes. All right, John Conan.
Good morning. Yes, I had some family fly into Kalispell for a family member that's did a job interview in Kalispell. So hoping they get to move here, but got to show them around where I used to live in the Kalispell area.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, let's see. Tony Warren is next.
Hey, good morning, Tristan. Good morning, everyone. I had the privilege of taking in 4 days of District 9C basketball, like several other folks online today. So I'm kind of basketballed out for a little while, but I'm ready to go in a few months again.
Oh, good. And then we've got McCall Flynn.
Thanks, Tristan. I got to see my parents this weekend who drove over from Anaconda. And then we also had the NASCAR race on. My dad is a big NASCAR fan. Whether we watched it or not is a different story. And then got to see some friends for coffee, and then kind of hid away when it got cold as well.
Yeah, it is pretty bitter out there right now. All right, so we're gonna let Jacob Williams introduce himself as well today, I think.
Hello, everybody. Friendly faces who I know from previous interactions, and those who I may not know. I just joined the meeting last week, but we couldn't remember if I had a chance to actually introduce who I was. I am a colleague of Eric's at the Region 17 Comprehensive Center. I have a long history of collaborating with OPI on assorted projects in terms of capacity building, as well as providing some direct support in the realm of school improvement to schools in Montana. So it's good to see everybody. Look forward to digging into this chapter and the great work we're going to get done.
Thanks, Jacob. Looks like we've got Eric online now too.
Yep. Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Eric. Thanks. And then, of course, Julie. I believe that is everyone.
It is good to see all of you. So yes, this is Julie. I'm in the 1300 building on 11th Avenue at OPI. Hoping to stay warm today. So it's good to see all of you, and it's refreshing to hear that you had a good long weekend. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So we have two outcomes for our time here together today, is to take one last look at that survey, finalize it so that we can get it deployed. And the second is to begin really looking and preparing for our meeting in March to build kind of that work plan of the rule revision. So we'll take time to look at those guided questions and kind of really unpack that and be thinking about what does that mean for us as we begin to start to form a conceptual memorandum. So today, what it's going to look like, next slide, please. We're going to spend a few minutes, though, just kind of recapping our work to date and be thinking about the through line as to what we've been doing to get to today. We'll spend 30 minutes on the draft of the survey, and then we're going to be spending the majority of time, about 50 minutes, kind of unpacking the task force proposed changes of some of those rules we'd want to keep, maybe some we'd want to modify, maybe some we'd want to add, and just kind of really start planning that out, what that will look like, so that we kind of have a good sense of where we're headed as we head into March 8th and 9th. And then public comment will be today from 12:45 to 1. And Tristan has indicated that she has gotten an email on public comment that she'll read to us during that time. So we'll be sure before public comment happens to kind of summarize up our session, talk about work between now and March 8th, so that we're all set and then ready to engage in public comment. Next slide, please. As a reminder, we are offering public comment in each of our sessions that folks can either write to us via email to Tristan, and that she will read that during the time, or they can come on to the meeting for 3 minutes and speak to us. Note that during that time, we don't respond or ask questions, but rather really listen intently to our public stakeholders during that time. Our group norms, next slide, please. Just a reminder of our working agreements to focus on what matters, to contribute our thinking, speak our mind and heart, listen to understand, link and connect ideas, and listen together for insights and deeper questions. Next slide. This is just a reminder that if we get into a voting, if anyone takes a motion and somebody seconds that motion, then we move into voting, we'd be looking at a supermajority of 60%. Don't anticipate that we'll be voting. I do anticipate, though, that we will be spending some time during our March meeting in person where we will be making some final decisions, which means we'll be building our consensus then. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder of what our purpose is together is to make recommendations on Chapter 55 revisions to the superintendent and the negotiated rulemaking committee, who will get into negotiations and build consensus around these rules, if you will. That is a very important piece. You guys are providing a lot of stakeholder input and thought around those recommendations that will go to the superintendent, so that when she gets to the negotiating table with the negotiated rulemaking committee, that they can begin to collaborate and build some consensus and negotiate, if you will, on the final changes that will be proposed. And so you guys play an integral role in that. Next slide, please. These are our deliverables. So it's to get that field survey out by February here. So that's coming close. So we got to get that out, get that finalized, and then begin drafting a concept memorandum, which we'll kind of go over today. I'll show you an example of that and kind of begin to think about what that means as we get ready for the next part of our big work task once that survey is out. Next slide, please. As a reminder, we are thinking about the accreditation framework kind of in 4 different buckets. The first one is around those characteristics or essential elements of quality schools. The second is around the accreditation process. The third is a kind of around the response to accreditation. like the variance to standards or corrective plans, what happens after the accreditation process is complete. And the final one is about school improvement, because this is rather a circular piece where once things get kind of assessed and measured and sent out, then how do we continue to really strive for improvement as an important piece of this process. We can go ahead now all the way to recapping our work. So slide 14, please. Yeah, Emily, I haven't changed that slide. We added people to the group. We've expanded. We grew back in right before our first meeting, and I need to go back and adjust that. You are correct.
Okay, great. I just realized I didn't do it to all attendees. My question was that I thought that a quorum would be 7 and not 5. So just so those who are listening who couldn't see that, that was my question.
Yep, I got to fix that. I noticed that too. I was like, oh boy, I haven't adjusted that slide. Okay, so moving to, if we will, let's just take a look at last meeting on the 8th. We had kind of gone out as a group and we talked to some people. We did some interviews of some stakeholders, and we tried to get a sense of kind of what are we hearing from our stakeholders around how do they determine if a school is successful? What are the essential elements? And how should we ensure these elements for success are in place? And then we had a question around what is the connection between quality standards and some of the staffing requirements. So what we had kind of come away with were these big themes around for the first question was student success. There was a piece around school climate that we saw come up quite a bit. We saw a piece around growth, not just measuring academic proficiency, but an emphasis on growth. There's a piece around satisfaction of all satisfaction. It was from parents and families and students and staff. There's a piece around staff and the professionalism and the efficacy that staff bring. There was a piece around additions for parents and family and community, and a component for post-secondary readiness, which were some of those things that we were seeing and hearing. In the second bucket, there was some pieces around essential elements of certified teachers, effective leaders, the positive environment that students feel education is relevant and that everyone is working together. And then there was a question about how should we ensure these essential elements? Is this to ensure highly competent, educated, and prepared staff and sufficient funding? So those were some of the themes, if you would, that we got from that. And then the last one, that question kind of threw people. It was kind of maybe the way it was worded and not sure kind of what it really meant. But what we did get away from that was this idea that there does need to be some flexibility built within. So that's kind of, an overview, but then individual comments, next slide. What we heard from you all were that from the first question, how do you determine if a school is successful? We heard Billy share about growth centered around academics. So again, that growth piece, a component around SEL and mindsets, and then the transition success beyond high school. And how can growth be an emphasis within the standards? So again, we heard from Billy kind of that notion of growth, school climate. We heard that piece around post-secondary readiness. From Gail, we heard an importance of data and about our school boards may need help interpreting accreditation data. And how does accreditation fit within a district strategic plan? And then from Dan, an emphasis on post-secondary outcomes, school climate, and how can each school work on a continuous process? So Dan's bringing in that notion of continuous process. For question 2 from our group here, what are the essential elements of a successful school? David had shared with us that trustees really need to kind of understand the role of social emotional learning in the public education and what does that mean? Versus academics, and quality school is not a factory, but parents, children, and employees expect supportive services and funding. So there's kind of this notion of what does a quality school mean from all of our different stakeholders. And then Emily had shared for us via Jewel, flexibility, relationships, and communication through quality staff and a positive school culture, and a shared vision with and by all stakeholders, and an emphasis on student success for all. So she was really bringing in kind of this notion of what is that shared vision for a quality school, again, about the positive school culture, which we see coming up as a theme here. Q3, please, next slide. How should we ensure that these elements for a successful school are in place? Heather Jarrett had shared with us level of responsibility that teachers and leaders and administrators have for quality school retention, if you will. All school stakeholders need to be questioned with school culture surveys. So she's starting to think a lot about the process of how this gets put into place, importance of funding, accountability, and mental health focus. She asked, are we asking the right questions when we talk about accountability, or should we be focused on different questions like retention of teachers and leaders? Are we asking what standards schools are using, state versus national, and how do we track and support school improvement over time? Janelle has shared that funding is a key issue, talked about highly qualified staff, need flexibility within the standards while retaining highly qualified staff, and how our flexibilities there, but still meet the standards. Also, where is local control in the curriculum? John had again also shared about a funding key issue, leadership, highly qualified staff, and importance of stakeholders to take part, if you will, in the accreditation process. And then the last question, Q4, what we had heard from our group was flexibility, funding, and highly qualified teacher staffing requirements does link to quality standards, but what to do when schools are struggling to meet goals? Schools have to make hard decisions. McCall had shared there was some confusion around this question, but stakeholders are interested in seeing staffing requirements and highly qualified teachers and want flexibility within staffing ratios and variances. So that kind of, you guys, just recaptures, if you will, where we were last week and what we were hearing among these different elements. So what I'd like us to do now, next slide, please, is I want you to just take a moment and reflect on the connections from when we were in the Capitol on the 25th and 26th, what we were working on then. And then we went out and did these interviews. And now we've started to take a look at the rules and really starting to think about which of those do we need to keep, which do we need to modify, which do we need to remove, and which maybe do we need to add. So I want you to kind of share out, what are your first thoughts about the overall work so far for chapter 55? What comes to mind specifically? And what are the most interesting discoveries you've made? And what are some of the most challenging moments and what made them challenging for you as you're thinking about this work and digging into this chapter? So I'm going to give you guys 1 minute to just kind of think independently. And then I'm going to have you, one person share, and then you can call on the next person. We'll popcorn it out, if you will. So you can answer any of these questions. You can answer all three, but I really want to hear your reflections to date and thinking about those connections and through line before we engage in our work today. And John, I'm probably going to call on you first, just as a warning here in 30 seconds. Okay, John, over to you.
I think one of the Can we start with the first question, obviously? Can you hear me?
Yeah, John, you're good. Go ahead with the
Oh.
first question. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Overall, I feel good about the work that we're doing with Chapter 55. What comes to mind is sitting down and listening to the rest of the group thought together. I know in person was very powerful. I learned a lot from sitting around the table. Obviously, it's just like instruction. It's not as good as soon as we go to online with this format to be better in person. But I know we can't keep grabbing people and pulling them out of their jobs to come do the work there. So overall, I was trying to think of I like how you have it formatted, Julie, to allow us to come up with opinions and back it up with rationale, and we get to hear everyone else's opinions. So for the most part, I think it's valuable work that we're doing. It's a monumental task, I think, once we put the question, what will school look like in 10 years in front of us? And so kind of did that with my administration team today as we go through our cognitive standards and looking at technology and what does technology look like in 10 years. And we had a hard time deciding, specifically what they're going to need to be ready for. So we looked at what skills that they need to be ready for, that any new technology that comes out, are they going to be able to tackle it? Kind of make it a scenario like asking my parents to take out their new iPhone. Do they have enough background knowledge to be able to run that device or not? And so I think that's our job, is thinking about it in that aspect, is how can we equip our students with the tools that we need to get them ready for a new technology device we don't know about, or a schooling environment that we don't know about yet.
Thanks, John. Can you call on the next person?
McCall.
Thanks, John. I think my initial thoughts were more around like how big Chapter 55 is and how much goes into the accreditation process. So I think initially I was thinking like, wow, this is going to be a really big undertaking. How are we going to do this in this kind of group setting with some in-person meetings and some online? I found it actually to be going pretty well. I think some of the most interesting discoveries that I've made is that it really does seem like the right people are at the table, and like John, it seems like we're having really good conversations and people are bringing different perspectives to the table, which I think has been very helpful to these discussions. I think for me, some of the most challenging moments have been because we're not necessarily working like specifically in the rules or in the rules and being able to see them and have conversations as a group. We've done that kind of in smaller group settings, but I'm one of those people that kind of likes to see it and discuss it and redline it as you go. And so it's for me, that's been a challenge, just to kind of sit back and watch that happen, all of these first things before we do start getting into those red line. I will go over to one of my former teachers, Miss Venturelli.
Thanks, McCall. It's nice to see you. Mostly grown up. So I think just an overall statement of I, as a former teacher now on the school board, that this brings home how important it is to have knowledgeable school board members. So often we are asked to vote on something, and I don't know that the rest of the board understands everything, even just as simple as what is A and B, and so it right now I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed as to the importance of this accreditation. Without it, you don't go forward with education. But how do we educate a school board? And in my mind, I see sitting down and creating some sort of a list of acronyms we have, and two, creating some sort of outline folder that can go from member to member, because this is important work. This is kind of the very basic foundation for public education. Thank you. Oh, I have to have a name here. Sorry. How about Heather? Oh, Heather H.
Thanks, Gail. I would concur with what other people are saying. My first thoughts of this is that this is a huge job, in the fact that it's done every 10 years and how much change we see in 10 years in education for both teachers, students, and our communities is just kind of mind-blowing when we think about how often information doubles now in our world for the students who are in the seats and the teachers who are teaching them and the leaders who are leading them. 10 years seems like an awful long stretch of time when we look at the changes that happen, but and it's just a very, very big job. The challenges, John, I think you spoke to it. Same thing is having conversations. I'm trying to talk with as many people as I can about the conversations that are about what we're talking about, gathering input, gathering insight, but the background just isn't always there. And so a quick conversation, which should take 10 to 15 minutes to gather input on, ends up taking more like an hour, where we're pulling things up and looking at things together. That's rich. And it's important, but the background, I think, for a lot of people just truly isn't there. But it's been good. It's been challenging, and I love listening to the viewpoints of everyone who's there as well, from the small schools to the rural consortiums to our collegiate partners. I think it's important. So just kind of echoes what everybody has to say. So Miss Janelle Beers, it's all yours.
Thank you. Some of the same things. I think John used the word monumental, and that's the first thing I wrote down, that this is a monumental task. Chapter 55 covers so much, and there's so many pieces to that puzzle. So once we look at one little part, the domino effect it can have on other pieces of those chapters. And so I think that's the biggest thing for me, as far as looking at it specifically, when that comes to mind, is like, oh my gosh, how are we going to do all this? Some of the interesting discoveries for me are, I came in knowing I was going to look at it from the small school view, but I really feel like after listening to everybody and all the different partners at the table, everybody's in this together, regardless of the size of your school or what lens you're looking at it from. They want everyone to be successful. And I'm not surprised. I'm just happy that that's the way it is, that we're all working toward the same thing together. And for me, I think the challenging thing is when I think about flexibility versus accountability. How do you make that all work so that you can be flexible for people, but still accountable to our students and our parents and our communities? So, I would go to, how about Daniel?
Thanks, Janelle. So my first thought about our work is how immense it is. We've talked about this, how big it is, but also how important it is. It's going to really make a big difference in how schools operate over the next 10 years. So I'm ever mindful of whatever we do will have a lasting impact. One of the most interesting discoveries I had was I read that article, an analysis of school quality and accountability rules in Montana. And if you haven't read it yet, I'd encourage you to do so. It's a great document, and it raises a number of, I think, important questions and suggestions. And I would encourage us to spend some time with this document and take it apart. For example, it raises a question about if students are performing at a satisfactory level, is there any other accountability necessary? You know, I'm not suggesting, please, don't write this down. It's like, I'm suggesting we don't look at licensure and safety and so on, but it raises some interesting questions about why we do this, and maybe looking at what a couple of other states, for example, Colorado does. And then finally, one of the most, I think, my most challenging moment is doing the homework assignment, where we had to kind of decide, what rules we keep, what rules need to be modified, and so on, that spreadsheet. I've done this several times, and each time I come back with, well, we need them all. And trying to decide which ones would we change is a little difficult for me. So I've struggled a little bit about what to keep and what to toss out and what to change. And I'll turn it over to, let's see who we have here. Heather Jarrett.
Thanks, Dr. Lee. My answers are very similar to the others who have shared. I think the importance of the task and the impact that this task has or potentially has on every single school size are some of my initial thoughts, I guess. And then when we're talking about interesting discoveries, I think it's the way in which everyone at the table thinks about chapter 55. The in-person meeting was very good because everybody at the table thinks a little bit differently in the different nuances, and I just really appreciate all of that. So that's been great. And then challenging moments, much like Dr. Lee, the thought of what changes to make or what to cut is just so hard, because everything is important, but the way in which maybe it's stated could be refined. And so that is just, it kind of has been very challenging and weighs heavy on one. So I'm glad we're doing it together. Let's see, I'll go to Billy next.
Well, my first thoughts about chapter 55 is that it's such an important piece of our education. And it's what's come about from it is just how detailed that our accreditation is, but also the importance of ensuring that we represent a full array of the stakeholders in Montana within our decisions and recommendations. I do agree with Janelle fully on the most challenging thing for me is balancing that flexibility and accountability, making sure that the uniqueness of our Montana schools and each of them individually is welcomed and encouraged, but also making sure that there is that accountability aspect in there. How about Tony?
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'd have to agree with several of the folks that have spoken already. Just sitting in rural north central Montana, where it's incredibly challenging to recruit and retain teachers. I think about the needs that we'll have in the coming 5-10 years as far as staffing. And from my perspective, we need as much flexibility as possible, but I also understand why it's important we continue to hold educators to a high standard. Probably my most challenging moments or times with this is just, it's an incredibly steep learning curve for me. Kind of reminds me of my first year or two as a school administrator, as I don't swim in these waters on a routine basis in my day-to-day work, but I've learned a lot over the last month or so, and I'm looking forward to working with folks in person down in Helena starting next month. So thank you. Let's see who I want to pick on. Let's see. I see Nathan Miller. Nathan, hello there.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, good.
I haven't really been a part of these discussions for the last couple of meetings, but I've been kind of trying to catch up. It seems like you guys are doing a lot of really good work and bringing up a lot of really good questions. So I would probably actually pass it over to somebody else who's been here that's worked on with these questions already.
Yes, I do want to welcome Nathan, you guys, to our group. He's been busy QAing the data that was in the team's report, and so he'll be joining us. And so, Mr. Miller, our Director of Accreditation, welcome to the team, and we're excited to have you with us.
Thanks.
Let's see. I think Emily Dean hasn't gone yet.
That is correct. So I guess first thought that I've had is, and I say this in every task force, and I will continue to say it in this one, that we're developing or updating the baseline. So I think with that, it's just really important to keep that in mind. One of the things that I think has been most interesting, and one of the things I know that we'll be focusing on preserving, is the flexibility that currently exists in Chapter 55 and ensuring that the flexibility that is there remains available for school districts. I think probably one of the more challenging pieces is I think that it's difficult when you consider when you're looking at the question of accreditation, and does that actually mean success? Because I think the baseline is different than what the definition of success is. And I know as being someone who's come from the classroom, I do struggle, because you obviously like high expectations were a constant in my classroom, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you know, if every student wasn't successful, that they weren't in a classroom that merited not being accredited, for example, because, you know, we're meeting students at all different places. And so I think that it is tricky to try to define success and then associate that with what is the baseline of accreditation. So I guess that's one of the things that I'll be struggling maybe a little bit with, but just, you know, ensuring that we, you know, are meeting the requirements of that a standard is the baseline and not, you know, the ideal, but the starting point. And I don't know if David's gone yet. So if I'm to choose someone, I think David, I will pass it to you.
Okay, Emily, thanks very much. Good to see you. I tell you, one of the first thoughts I had about coming in here to this task force is 26 years in the Marine Corps must not have taught me a single thing, because rule number one is never volunteer. And I volunteered for this, and I immediately discovered it was well outside my pay grade. But I'm excited to learn something new every day from folks like yourself. Interesting discovery is, as I started looking into this, I started looking at the other states' accreditation process to include at the federal level, and their processes and their accreditation standards and how they accredit their educational institutions literally are different state to state. There's no continuity. Everybody does indeed do it different. And sometimes that was frustrating, and other times it was interesting because I learned something new from these other states. For example, many of the states tend to lean a lot toward third-party evaluators, such as Cognia and the Montana University uses Northwest, some other system, and how valuable that they are to the accreditation process of state schools. And then finally, the challenging moments, I got two of them. One is I started talking to some folks down at the Mercantile and at Kevin's Hardware about what I was doing, and their eyes glazed over, and they had no idea what I was talking about or why I would even be interested in accreditation. So that's a challenge, to get the stakeholders in the community to understand how important it is to know about their school's accreditation. And then, and then another challenging moment was how in the world are we going to get all these cats where they belong in a manner that the public will understand and get interested in. That's my biggest challenge. So anyway, I'm not sure who else to call on, Julie.
I believe
think-
that was everyone.
Yeah. Good. I thought so, Tristan. So that validates that. Thank you guys for taking the time. That's so important for me because I'm trying to really, formulate and get ready for our in-person meeting and really trying to get a sense of kind of like, where are we? And it really does kind of help me connect, if you will, the in-person to the virtual and to kind of keep a flow of work going to meet our deliverables. So thank you for taking that time. I'm going to turn it over now to Eric and Jacob to help us finalize our field survey. So we'll kind of switch gears here, but thank you for so much thoughtfulness and reflection and insight as to where you're at today. And it's exciting to think about where you will be at the end of our two-person meeting in March. Over to you, Jacob and Eric.
Thank you, Julie. Eric, are you ready to make adjustments? And I think, so Tristan, you are sharing the survey. Let me just scroll down quickly and make sure we're looking at the correct version. So if I can see the first real question, just to see the responses, make sure is it Eric, are you sharing your screen?
Yes, Eric is in control.
Okay. All right, Eric's in control. All right, so Eric, then we'll scroll back up to the first question. We did our best to try and incorporate all of the feedback that occurred at our last task force meeting to come up with a version that we feel comfortable sending out. As we go through, know that some questions certainly can be eliminated, but we wanted to provide all options in this draft to look at. The first question that we had quite a bit of discussion on were the roles. And if everybody could quickly take a look at this, Eric, if you could maybe zoom in just a skosh, so it's a little bit bigger for people, that'd be helpful. All right, that's perfect. So now I think we can see all the options. The question is, did we capture all of the feedback? Is there any role listed that we think is confusing, that may not be understood, or is there a role that needs to be added? We don't want it to be too overwhelming for people, but also at the same time comprehensive. Emily, I see your hand up first, so we'll let you go ahead, and then David will come next.
Yeah, I actually, we've had some discussions about this internally. One of the things that I would know is that I think that if you're going to include constituencies that are not necessarily responsible for ensuring schools that meet accreditation, it should be two separate surveys. I think that it makes perfect sense for this survey to go out to teachers and staff, administrators, school board members, and those employed or governing our school districts. But I don't think it makes sense to include students, parents, community members, business leaders within the same survey, because I mean, you're just asking for skewed results because you're not using any type of methodology, polling methodology, to really find out if you're getting an actual sample that would provide results of what the broader public believes. We do know how to get a hold of every single person employed or governing a school district, but we do not have the same type of capabilities when it comes to the broader public. So I would urge two separate surveys, and in a survey that is for the public, have it conducted by an actual polling firm where you are going to have methodology that will give you reliable results as to what the general public believes accreditation should include.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Daniel, I saw you wave your hand, but David had his hand up first, so we'll come to you right after David. Daniel,
Well,
go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, very quickly, I absolutely agree with Emily. I'm looking at it as a layperson community member, and I put a don't know on well over half of the questions. I didn't understand the content of the question. I had no idea what some of the standards were. And so I found myself putting don't know on almost every one of these as a community member.
Daniel.
Yeah, I get the idea that we're just trying to get it. this question, just trying to get at like broadly, who's responding to this survey? I think maybe if you italicized that best describes so that the respondent looks at that and says, okay, what would best describe me? If they can't answer the question, they can't answer the question. But I think, for example, business people and community members should have they pay taxes and they should have some say in how we accredit schools. So now if they don't understand it, well, they don't understand it. They shouldn't fill it out. But I don't think we should start from the assumption that because they're a business leader or a community member or higher education faculty or staff member or retired person, that they don't directly work with schools, that they don't have an opinion or that they wouldn't understand it. That's just my thought.
So Emily, can I come back to you for some clarification? Were you suggesting, as David was, that we would have two completely different surveys, or just that the community survey would be handled in a way that would give a more reliable sample?
I didn't mean to. I mean, I think administering it separately, I don't necessarily think you need a different survey, but I don't think that you should have all groups done in one survey. And it's simply because we know how to get a hold of every person that works for a school district or is an elected member of a school board. We know who those people are. We don't know who every single business leader or community member in the entire state of Montana is. And so I would assert that we should use a polling methodology that would ensure results that would provide a consistent view of what, a community is saying or business leaders are saying. I think that combining them together, you're asking for survey results that are not going to probably give you the type of information that we would like to take action on. So I don't think that it needs to be, the content of the surveys need to be different, but I think it needs to be conducted separately.
So Emily, I hear you suggesting maybe a couple of different ways that the survey is deployed, because we can get it out to, like you're saying, the constituents. I could send you an email and say, can you get these out to the board trustees, right? Like get this survey link out to them, versus when it comes to our community members and our students, that may be a little bit more difficult to do. So I'm also wondering, and Eric and Jacob, this is a question over to you. Is there a way though, when the data gets sorted, that we can really see by group what the responses are? Because if it meshed it all together, you're not going to get a sense of, this percentage of people did respond from each role, and then kind of what the responses are from that. So you can see that data, not just as a whole. I don't know. It's just two different thoughts.
Yeah, so I think what you're asking is, once the data is collected, can you disaggregate it by role? Certainly you could in any way. You could combine administrators or teachers, or just look at community members. Like you certainly would be able to disaggregate data based upon their responses, what their role was.
I guess maybe I should clarify my comments a little bit. I'm not worried about if you did one survey being able to disaggregate. What I'm worried about is that you're going to have, even when you disaggregate it, say we just take all of the community members, business leader, parents, students, just like you're not, when you take a poll on, Facebook, that is not a poll that provides actual reliable data in terms of what the general public thinks, because it's just the people who saw that Facebook poll, which is why, for example, the Montana Public Education Center group does annual polling every year to understand the thoughts and opinions of Montanans in terms of public education. We conduct that through Zogby polling every year, so that we ensure we get an adequate sample size that meets actual polling methodology to ensure that you're getting an accurate view of what the general public thinks. I don't think that we're necessarily going to get a sound view of what all parents in Montana think if we just put a link out on the internet and say anyone who wants, take this poll. You get that by actually pulling a sample size, ensuring that you're meeting all the criteria that create standard, consistent, quality methodology needs, and then move from there. So that's my concern. And I mean, polling in Montana is not that expensive. It's just simply not. So I don't think that it would be, for something that happens once every 10 years, I don't think that would be unreasonable for us to actually make sure that we are getting a poll that is consistent with what the broader public thinks if we're asking what parents, community members, business leaders actually believe.
Thank you, Emily. So Julie, Emily's speaking just to sampling, taking steps to ensure that representative sample is obtained.
Thank you, Emily.
You're welcome.
Okay, outside on this first question, outside of good conversation around sampling, I didn't hear any specifics around adjustments in terms of terms that are used.
I think Dan has his hand up.
I don't, Daniel, I think it's still up, right?
Yeah, again, I don't, these categories are fine for just general idea. I get Emily's point, though. I mean, if we look at what the business leaders say in this survey, if you don't carefully distribute it in such a way to ensure clear understanding of what business leaders think, so, by polling methods, well, yeah. Is that the purpose of that? Is that the purpose of this survey, is to get the feel for all people across the entire state in all categories? So I'm not sure I understand. I thought the idea was this is a general survey, but I agree. We could, if we got 8 business leaders, what can you make of that? Probably not much. So I get her point.
David, you put your hand back up.
Yes, are we going to have them mark only one of the best or any of the best?
The purpose is to select the one that best aligns to your role. Granted, you could be an administrator and a community member, or you could be an administrator and a parent, but I think we want to be able to differentiate by the lens that you completed the survey, essentially.
Okay, thank you.
Julie, can you speak to the purpose that might be beneficial before we move on here as to what's possible and what are the expectations in terms of this?
Yeah, the purpose really is a general survey to inform us as the task force around kind of, where we head into when we start talking about redlining the rule, right? Do we have some general information that helps us see kind of from all the different stakeholders to kind of guide us in that process, if you will? That's the purpose. It's not to report out that, school administrators in Montana think this. It's basically to share with us to say, based upon our data, right, we can see that school administrators, there's a strong emphasis here or there, which is to help us, if you will. That's the purpose.
Julie, Janelle had sent me a message as well asking how we are planning to get the survey out. Are you able to share?
Yeah, I was planning on just trying to get the links out to different, communication avenues that we have. But after our conversation, I'm going to have to think about what's going to be the best way to do that. So I think that's a really good question and love to hear any other thoughts about that, if you will. Because I understand what Emily's saying around sampling and distribution and all of that from a polling perspective. But I guess the question becomes, how do you guys feel would be the best avenue to get this out so that we can get as much information as we can to inform our work?
Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I kind of thought this item was just so you could get some general idea of who the respondents were to this survey. 1% were business leaders, 32% were board members, something like that. So it just gives you an idea of describing the sample. It doesn't suggest that we should draw any particular inferences. If it's a school district board member trustee, they all say that. Even if we had half of them were trustees, we probably couldn't say with any reliability that this represents all trustees across the state. So the idea behind this question is just to develop some sort of description of who are the respondents and where they hail from.
Okay, let's keep that in mind as we scroll on down to the first question. How important do you think the following items related to school performance are to determining K-12 school quality? And we tried to the greatest extent possible, put these in layman's terms. Some things are hard to do because some specific terms do describe them. And we did add the don't know option, which, as David spoke to, tells us whether someone understands what's going on in accreditation or within education as a whole, and potentially leads to some further work, but doesn't necessarily help with this process. Specific comments about this question? And could we potentially, if just drop the link in the chat if we didn't do that too, so people could pull it up on their own if they wanted. As well as it's hard to see the whole screen. I'm gonna let Heather, you're at the top of my screen if you want to go ahead.
Thank you. One of the things that I just noticed is on the second question, I guess, how much students increase their state test scores from year to year. I would much prefer a growth question because we had quite a lengthy discussion about growth and the importance of student growth. So I'd like to see that there rather than the use of increase, even though they're kind of the same thing. It's that little nuance that I value, I guess.
So if we just had student growth on test scores from year to year.
Yeah, I would appreciate that.
So grow their state test scores.
Or have growth, maybe.
Okay, how much
Growth students have.
How much have students grown?
So if I can jump in here because mine's on that same one.
Go ahead, Billy.
This is Billy. So this one throws me off because I think about our state tests and students are testing according to different degree of standards each year. So how is the comparison from when they test on third grade standards, then on fourth grade standards, comparable to ask about growth or about increasing their scores? I don't think that it offers that.
Well, I think you don't. What you measure is your cohorts of third graders. So you could change that to schools, right? This is a nuance that people may not understand, right? Because you're really looking at school performance. So you're looking at, how much growth did you see from year to year in cohorts. It is tricky to do, for sure.
I mean,
That's why growth models for state assessment are complicated.
but
So
some assessments such as the MAP scores, those offer more data that offers the growth, but our state tests don't necessarily offer that data. So I think that is a very difficult question as posed like that.
I would say, Billy, this is Julie. We do measure growth on the statewide assessments, the summative assessments, and we do have a growth measure of how we do that for schools in the federal accountability system. But we do not use individual, like you're saying, formative assessments, if you will, when we measure that growth. So we do have a growth indicator where we try to take a look at how much did a group of third graders grow to fourth grade compared to other schools. So it starts to take a look at which schools kind of grew more than others, if you will. But it's not on an individual student growth, the way it gets calculated. So we do already calculate growth for our fourth graders through our eighth graders on the state summative assessments.
I would put this forth as a lens too, is that what we want to capture here is do respondents think growth is important, period? And not be so concerned about the logistics and the calculations of that, is that this lets us know people think growth is important, and that's informative for the task force. That informs changes in accreditation, which could be separate of state assessments potentially, and could give information to the state if they are ever looking to change state assessments as well, as there are new state assessments that potentially do demonstrate growth more easily being rolled out as we speak.
So I see Heather H's hand is up. I also see a comment from a Renee in the chat.
Go ahead, Heather.
Oh.
Heather, did you put your hand down? Just give me a thumbs up if you're good.
Oh, nope, sorry. I had not unmuted myself. I was just wondering if we had settled on a 5-point Likert scale, or if we were going to go with a 4-point to try to force decisions versus letting people kind of ride that fence, which oftentimes people taking polls do. If it's a 5.1, they settle on number 3 very often. So I wasn't sure if we had talked about that. I thought we had, but I couldn't remember.
Does anybody have a comment on that for the group? Pros and cons, what Heather put forth. The potential con is that you can end up with neutral responses, which could inform the group that it's not an area of focus in terms of work. Or, if you eliminate the neutral response, then then you have an option of how people feel, whether it's more positive or more negative in terms of digging into something. So any thoughts on the 5-point scale before we move any further?
So do we keep it as is or move it to 4? Or?
Yeah, that's what we're asking. Does anybody have any thoughts on whether we should change it?
You can move it to a 4. If you move it to a 4, then you do force people to have to choose between a 2 and a 3. I would just say then you would want to describe like not very important, not important to very important. I would classify rather than being on a spectrum of 1 to 5.
Okay, so let's not get, yes, thank you, Julie. And also we should note that when this is actually distributed, it'll be in a different survey platform where you'll be able to list those out as well. You can't do that in Google, but in the Alchemor setup, or no, it's not Alchemor that you guys use, it's Qualtrics setup, you can put the full Likert descriptions in. But I didn't hear any other specific comments on whether or not to change it outside of Heather's bringing that up. So let's let's move forward and people can chew on it. If additional thoughts come up, maybe as we look at other questions, clarity will be added and we can come back to it. So any other comments on these responses that are response options that are here? So we've added the growth language. David, did you have a hand up? Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I'm looking here at my notes. Is there one that reads, am I looking at the percentage of eligible students who graduate on time? Have I got the right?
High school graduation rates would be that.
There it is. Percentage of eligible students who graduate on time. Do we need to define on time?
I feel like that's probably an overlap with high school graduation rates, and we could eliminate one of those.
Okay, I would agree with that too.
Which one do we think is less useful?
Well, again, my concern was, would the survey, those taking the survey, have a concept of what on-time graduation looks like?
Okay, so maybe we would drop question 5 and keep, or item 5 and keep item 3.
Heather, go ahead.
Just for that, just the on-time graduation for some districts, and I'm not sure how consistent it is when we explain graduation rates to our school boards. It's important that they differentiate between the number of kids who stick around to finish their diploma if they need extra time versus the completion rate versus the on-time graduation rate. I thought maybe that's what they were drilling down into with that question, or we were, but I'm not 100% sure. But I don't know if that helps or not, David. I know I spend a lot of time with my school board differentiating between the two and talking about additional support services we provide.
Gail, go ahead.
I think both are important. I understand, like on time, I would say qualify within 4 years or some, because that's important for planning for the next step, whether you go and you actively, if a student quits, then you need to know how, that's another conversation, I guess. But it's important in our district to know why students are quitting and how do we bring them back. So
Federal reporting does require 4 and 5 year rates be reported. I mean, I know that the general public probably doesn't know that, but that's just to Heather's point. So we have one sort of vote from David in favor of removing number 5, which speaks to on time. And then one from Gail that's sort of in favor of keeping that. Anybody want to speak in favor of either one? Go ahead, David.
Well, yeah, and then let the pendulum swing back in the other direction. What about those with the modern flexibility within public school systems that will actually complete 12 years of education early? So will that number be in, are we looking for that number also?
They're still counted in the 4-year graduation rate for schools.
Okay, okay.
So would we add in parentheses here within 4 years?
I think, Gail, that was sort of what you were pointing to. Is that correct?
yes, that would do. Yes, thank you.
Okay, and I think afterwards we can do a little bit of reordering if it makes sense to keep those questions. Oh, maybe I can do it. Oh,
go ahead, Janelle.
Well, I'm not sure it's even that important either way, because what we're asking is, do they think that's important as far as, what a school, quality school is, those kind of things. So they may not be thinking about a specific school, but whether that is a measure. And so I think we could keep both of them, and they may not be specifically thinking about a school and, is that important what they think? So I think they could both stay in.
Okay.
Okay, last call on this question before we move on to the next one. Okay, Eric, if you could scroll on down.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see if I can save it and reshare the preview so folks can see it. Hold on a second.
Eric, because you're in Google Forms, it should save as you go.
Yeah, I've got it. I'm just trying to preview it so they can see the full. Sometimes the items get cut off.
Mhm.
Okay, so after that list of options is presented, then there's an open-ended question that says, list any other ways to measure K-12 school performance you think are important to ensure school quality.
Is everybody okay with just having the open-ended to capture anything that maybe we didn't list? It's unlikely that we would get enough responses around one thing that it would potentially change, but important to know what people's thinking may be, as it could inform other decisions.
Okay, so then the next question talks about how important do you think each of the following items related to school staff are to K-12 school quality? So the previous one was kind of school performance, kind of like the school as an ecosystem, as a holistic ecosystem. And here it's related, here it's breaking down schools to school staff specifically.
So again, the attempt was to capture some specifics that are in the current rules while attempting to put it into as understandable as language as possible. Retention, of course, is not currently in the rules, but was brought up as something to pursue as a possibility. Retention is the last question, average length of time staff stay at a school. Heather.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. I ran this by a family member last night who is also an educator, and that's the one that popped up too, that we think there may be some confusion if this isn't, an educator. Like his thing was this community perception of how long teachers actually work. So is this where we think of it as longevity? Are they thinking of it as, well, the teacher beats the kids out to the bus at the end of every day type thing? So just maybe tweaking the wording on that a little bit.
Maybe we call that retention, or put in parentheses retention.
Or maybe we even said employment, average length of versus time employment. I don't know.
Yeah, I think employment's a better word potentially. Heather, Jarrett.
I'm just curious about the language usage of properly licensed versus certified. And maybe just understanding that a little bit better, because library media specialists are properly licensed. So it's a little bit confusing to me as what you're trying to derive there, I guess.
Yeah, I can understand the confusion. So I think the attempt is properly licensed would be like certified in the area where you would teach. And which essentially is what the same thing as certified is saying here as well. So we could change that certified for properly library media specialist to properly licensed library media specialist. Would that be more clear?
Yeah, I just think consistency would be best throughout.
Same thing for school counselors. Good catch. Let her get to where he wants to. If we can go back to the
Okay, any other changes to this question then? And then that's also followed by an open-ended question to capture any other items people did not see in the list.
Okay. Scroll on down. So we've looked at, essentially we've looked at, as our language we talked about last week, the output, which is the performance. And now we've looked at the inputs in terms of staff. So then our next question is on policy and programs, which are also input. And again, these are looking at specifics that are currently in rule. There is some synthesis that happens here of trying to capture the broad sort of set of rules in some cases.
Looks like Heather H has her hand up.
Yeah, just when we look at the top, guys, where it says rules to help create a positive school climate, if you're thinking of PBIS and MBI and those things, they don't use the term rules, they use the term expectations. This is a little tiny splitting hair thing, but it might be something that pings with some of our schools who are heavily involved in that process. So.
Well, let's think about that for a second, though, because we're thinking about accreditation rules versus if we were just putting expectations in a chapter, is that different than a rule?
I do think that that point, you guys, is really good, Jacob and Heather, because rules might also mean disciplinary rules, right? It may be thinking about it being discipline policies, and I don't think that's what the essence of this is about. So I think it's, so maybe a different word than rules.
Is it program requirements?
Mm-hmm. I think that's what it's, yeah. And it might not be create, but it might just be requirements to have a positive school culture. Because you want to keep one and maintain it too. So maybe it's have instead of just create.
Gail?
What about just programs to help create a positive school climate?
We've got a couple of suggestions for guidelines. When we ask these questions, it makes me think of the report that David mentioned, and thinking about as we do this sort of language that is aspirational for schools and language that sort of creates mandates for schools. And this is the language I think we're getting at here too, is like, is a guideline something that's mandated for a school, or what are we asking specifically? Like, should we just give like the structure that you should have in place, or are we saying you have to have these things in place?
I think guidelines will work for the purpose of what we're trying to get at here.
Wording is a little awkward. Guidelines for having a positive school climate, guidelines for, or just guidelines for positive school climate.
Heather Jared recommended maybe program requirements, again, thinking about consistency. So program requirements for a positive school climate.
Okay. Gail and then David. Go ahead, Gail. Or did you just not put your hand down from a previous comment?
Yeah, I just didn't put my hand down. Sorry.
Oh, okay. David?
Oh, okay, Kim, are we ready to move on?
Oh, okay. Possibly. Yes. I just
Well,
had.
well, I'm looking down at number 7, Board of Trustee policy requirements.
Mhm.
What is that? What are we asking there? Are we saying how important district policies are that are approved by the board? Is that the idea?
I think it's requirements for Board of Trustees.
Board of Trust for? Okay.
So David, those are kind of already in there in rule, right? In the 700s.
Right. I was going to say, well, okay. I was going to say that we have to do certain things anyway, whether the public thinks they're important or not. And we have to have policies in place to operate the school. So I was just curious, what is it that the survey is looking for?
The survey is looking for, do we think that those requirements are essential to be a part of Chapter 55, or could they live somewhere else?
Oh, okay.
Should we say requirements for boards of trustees or policies for boards of trustees, written policies for boards of trustees? Julie, do you know what the spirit of the 700s?
Do we want to say district policies approved by Board of Trustees?
What's the spirit
You
of the
could
current
say
policy?
district, you could say district policy requirements.
Gail?
Those policies are required by law. I mean, well, most of them you can individualize your policies, but the bulk of policies come from law. So while I firmly believe that boards have to have policies, I don't know where the public would step in. Do they have knowledge of the policies would be interesting, but yeah. So it is, I can see how it would be confusing. What about the Board of Trustees policy requirements? Are those the state mandated ones? Well, we don't have a choice, then we have those.
So just to kind of quickly go over them, right? You guys, 1055, 701, to just give you a sense of what's in there right now, is under Board of Trustees. The local Board of Trustees shall ensure that the school district complies with all local, state, and federal laws. And then each school district shall make available to the staff and public, like the strategic plan, and what's in that plan, like a copyright policy, a policy that defines the use of school facilities and resources. So that's what it's trying to capture, is feedback on that. I just wanted to share that with you guys to give you some examples.
And again, I think the question is, it's not whether or not that those policies exist in law, because they do somewhere else, correct? That won't go away. It's, is it essential that adherence to those policies be tied to what is considered to be a quality school in Montana that needs to be monitored and checked upon within the realm of Chapter 55? That's the question we're trying to get at. So it's essentially is like, is it essential that there are board of trustee policies and that they're directly tied to school quality?
About policy requirements for boards of trustees?
I don't know if what I said added any clarity or not.
So I guess the question would be, keep it or take it out, guys?
Well, if I may, Julie, maybe the column number 6 will take care of that for us when the survey is released.
They don't know.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, possibly just wording, but number 5 says limiting class size. I'm wondering, should that be class size limits? Or something about it. That's more of a wording, not so much the substance.
Okay, that's good, Eric. Let's scroll on down to the next question.
Okay, and then again, there's an open-ended question to capture any K-12 school policy and program requirements that you think are important. Okay, I see Julie's asking how many more questions there are. Yeah, we have a few here. So I think we're making relatively good progress.
Okay, because I want to get through it pretty quickly. Just taking a look at the time, I'm going to need to be able to set homework, and at 12:45, we're going to have to go to public comment. So I'm hoping we can get this finished in I would say 7 minutes, maybe.
Yeah,
Not
we
to
can.
push time, just trying to process here, guys, time.
Okay. So we went through all of the rule questions. The next question is just on how monitoring should take place, whether it should happen via school self-reflection, on-site reviews, remote monitoring of data and documents, review of the continuous improvement plan, or don't know. Is there anything here that we need to add or take away? We're just trying to get a sense of what the accreditation process should look like. Okay, next question, Eric, is on which schools should be monitored. We tried to capture all of the options here. We did combine elementary and middle into one category. Unsure if we should separate those or not. And then the idea of doing whole districts versus schools. Okay, next question, Eric. How frequently? We gave an option from every year to 5 years. The link will be onto the, it'll go to the actual chapter itself, David, and it'll be included in there. That's where the most up-to-date and specific language lives. Okay, so now let's put a pin in that. And if anybody had a chance to look at these next questions, which talk about the effectiveness of sort of the process as a whole, the question would be, are these worth leaving in? Should we make them optional, or should we just eliminate these questions, which are how essential or how effective are the current procedures and schedules? How effective are the current standards, to get people's sense on them? We did not take them out. We know there was some discussion last week to take them out, but David says these are the ones the community folks struggled with. Gail?
Sorry, nope.
Yeah, I think Jacob and I were a little ambivalent about these two.
So I would recommend to the group to consider taking them out, but don't know, because I think they're kind of captured above.
Billy?
I don't think that they're needed. I think that those are very difficult for people to read and give good feedback on.
Okay, so every vote so far has been to take them out. Is anybody opposed to that? Okay, so if you can just scroll on down, Eric, we can come back and cut those out. And then just have some open-ended questions to get people's sense if they had anything else they want to add. These are optional questions, not required. What do you like most about the accreditation system? What do you like least? What changes would most improve the K-12 accreditation system? Just gives people an option if they choose to give some additional thoughts that they haven't yet provided. Is it too overwhelming to leave these in? Should we remove these as well, or are they worth leaving in as optional? David, meaning that people were bored with it by the time they get to these final ones?
Yes, I suspect that might well be the case.
So some votes to leave them in as long as they're optional, one vote to take them out.
Maybe we leave them in since they're optional. So
I think I'm going to put forth that if we do, we put optional in parentheses so people know for sure they're optional and they can just skip them, because people don't always see the red star that may be beside it. Is anyone adamantly opposed to that option of making it clear they're optional? Again, understood that we're not going to get sufficient information to capture what everybody's thinking, but every information is useful for the group in some fashion. Okay, if there's no other comments, Julie, I think we wrapped it up within your timeline.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Just one final, any thoughts you guys on distribution, how to get this out before we jump to the next topic? Okay, Eric, can you take me to slide 23? Thank you, guys. I think we can officially say that we have one of our deliverables is complete, and we will get that out. So what I want to do is really be sure we're set up for our next meeting on in person in March, and so that we're really ready to start kind of doing some rule revision. So that's our next big deliverable. So when we look at the timeline, we're right now, you know, in that time between November and April, which is where we're working. We will next can you go to the next slide really quick? We will on Thursday be doing just orientation with the negotiated rulemaking committee. Just bring that up to you. And we will actually be meeting in person before March 17th, where we could give a portion of our initial recommendations to the negotiated rulemaking there in March. So just share that with you in terms of timeline of kind of where we're headed. So we wouldn't need to have the complete, if you will, conceptual memorandum done, but at least a portion of it, so that we have some important pieces to hand off to that negotiated rulemaking committee as they begin negotiating. So can we go to the next slide? So I did kind of want to give you just a view of kind of a sample of what we're talking about. And this is from chapter 57. So in the actual memorandum, we'll be kind of highlighting up front some of the conceptual changes and some of those big areas that we would be looking at before we start like putting in the red line. So these would be things, and this is an example from chapter 57, and this was about providing additional pathways to demonstrate content and pedagogical knowledge beyond the traditional testing, if you will. And so what you'll see here is it kind of talks about adding that concept, if you will, and that was a big conceptual change to these rules. And so these are not, currently there's not multiple pathways, right, to demonstrate your content expertise in licensure. So this was a pretty big conceptual change, and you'll see that the superintendent did agree with the task force recommendation and then provided a rationale. So I bring that forward to you guys because we're gonna, next slide, we're gonna wanna be thinking about what are our conceptual changes? Like, where do those really live? Here's another example, which was a pretty big different conceptual change, which is for if your license has expired from out of state or in state, and you have to get it back current, that you could have two different ways that you could get back and have those recency requirements met. You could do 6 semester credits, or you could do professional development units as well in a combination, right? So that was a pretty big conceptual change to the rule. So I just kind of wanted to give you guys this to be thinking about. What are some of those maybe conceptual changes that we want to be sure are in there, right? And I've heard us talk about growth. I've heard us talk about school climate. So there's some of those pieces are starting to bubble up, if you will, as to what are some of those conceptual changes that may come into the rule. Next slide, because this is then how it starts to look, right? Then you begin actually taking a look at current rule and then making proposed changes to it. So you'll see on the very left-hand column, that's what's current rule. And so this is an example. And then this is the recommended changes that were provided by the task force. And these are actually also the superintendent's final recommendations, and then the rationale over there. So you can see they talked about adding the pathway to be beyond just 6 semester credits to include professional development, which then required that the word renewal be expanded to professional development so that it could cover both of those. So I'm just giving you some examples because I really want us to be thinking about, next slide. I want us to be thinking about in these areas here. We did our guiding questions this last week of kind of what do we see bubbling up as rules that we should keep, modify, rules we should add. And so there's that piece. We've also got our informal interview piece. And so really start to be thinking about when we come together in March, we're really going to kind of hone in on those conceptual changes. And so I want to be able to kind of really dig into maybe what some of those concepts are so that then we can start to recommend what the rule revisions would be. Next slide. So, you know, you could be thinking about these potential conceptual changes into those 4 different framework categories that we talked about. It could be conceptual changes that address the essential elements of a quality school. It could be potential conceptual changes to the accreditation process. So it could be on a piece to the response. That's what happens, right? Once you get a certain area, do you continue with the variance to standards? And the last one is around that school improvement. So you could be thinking about those conceptual things within that. I tried to kind of put some example here, you guys. So it's like positive supportive climate, right? We've talked about that. We just saw that in the survey. Now, what are some of those guidelines? Are those going to be essential elements? So are we going to want to enhance some of the components around a positive school climate? That might be a conceptual change. Then we would want to rationalize why. Why is that an important conceptual change to the rules? We've seen and highlighted a little bit around post-secondary readiness. Is that a piece beyond just if you will, graduation requirement that's put in as the student performance thing? What would that potentially be? So I'm wanting you guys to really start to think about and identify, so that when we come together March 8th and 9th, I'm going to actually ask you to turn them in a little bit early as part of your homework. But I want you to begin to think about what are some potential conceptual changes. So I want to pause there just on what I've shared with you, what we mean by that, because I want you to have kind of a view of what the final product begins to look like that we'll be working on. I do see one comment. Let me see here from Gail. Thanks, Gail. Okay, questions for me on what I mean by conceptual changes. Okay, so that's going to be the first part of your homework, is to kind of start to identify what some of those might be, so that as I begin to craft our 8th and 9th meeting, I really have kind of maybe even some content experts available to be there for those areas, so that we can be thinking about the rationale for why we would be adding those to the rules, enhancing some rules, or changing them. But we have that conceptual understanding. Okay,
So
and go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Julie. I wonder if more examples might help, or if referring back to something we saw previously might help them, like either looking at this framework or this list of this list here.
Yep. I think those interview responses is really critical. I think that list is a good one. We can definitely pull from there. I think that looking at kind of what you see popping up in the rule change guiding document that you guys just did, and we'll send that link around again, but that'll give you also some ideas of some conceptual pieces. And then the last thing I want to share with you from homework is so upcoming date. Let's go to slide 31 really quick. So that, again, you guys, we're going to be in person March 8th and March 9th. So hopefully you've got your arrangements made and are ready to come, so that we're looking at walking away from that meeting with at least a good, start of our conceptual changes, at least a portion of them, that we then could pass off to the negotiated rule committee, which starts on the 17th, for them to begin looking at. Next slide. So next steps, I'm also, and Tristan put these in your Google document, but there's two different documents that the Region 17 Comp Center put together. And the first one is called a state accreditation scan. And so this is taking a look at a lot of different states, different ways for accreditation, just for you to kind of just get a sense of, sometimes it can kind of help you to look at what other examples are. Not saying that's what we want for Montana. We want Montana specific, but it does kind of give you an idea of, I'm just curious to know, where do we stand in comparison to others on some of these? So they've put together a great accreditation scan. You'll see states, and then it kind of goes through and shares what that are. And then the second one is another document that the Comp Center put together around two other components, and that's on our framework on like the third and fourth circle. But one is about continuous improvement planning. And so that kind of gives you an idea of what other states are doing and what you can see happening in continuous improvement planning processes. And then the last one is kind of around that variation to standards. It gives you kind of some state examples on how different states are doing flexibility, if you will, and holding accountable, which is a piece that I know I heard from Janelle today, and I heard maybe it was Emily, but I think that'll give you just kind of some examples as well to be looking at and to be thinking about. So we have those already, like I said, in your Google website. And so those are just two different documents. The first one is called the accreditation scan, and then the second one has those two pieces together. So we will also, I'll be communicating out to you kind of what's going on with the survey link. So expect an email from me kind of sharing what we're doing to get that out, and expect a email that will have a request for you to be doing your homework around submitting potential conceptual changes that we'll be looking at in preparation for our March meeting. If you would please take a look at these and review these documents from the Region 17 Comp Center. So any questions for me on homework before we go to public comment?
And we'll give David extra credit because it sounds like he was just reviewing these documents already. So gold star for you, David.
Yeah, I did have one question. I'm wondering, I know I'd asked this during the advocates meeting, but can we get the Google site posted on the OPI Chapter 55 webpage?
So we did kind of talk about that, in terms of we have the meeting minutes up, the summary. There was part of conversation about is there ability to keep that, Emily, for the working group as they're working documents, as they're working in there, so that they're kind of shared among them. That is what's really like, is there something that we're not being transparent about that needs to be, that's not being shared already via the recordings and the minutes and the summary? As to what the purpose is for having outside advocates having access to our website as well. Was kind of the conversation.
I mean, do you want me to answer why we would like it posted?
Yeah, I mean, that would help me as I finish up that conversation with leadership.
So I provide weekly updates to our members every week as to where we are in these conversations. And there's been requests to be able to get access to see, what is the task force looking at, and what are they considering? What are their materials? I mean, I know they're all already public documents, obviously, just by their creation, but having those available at an easy link already on the OPI Chapter 55 page would be helpful.
Okay, that helps me, because it was kind of like, it was like, well, what can you tell me why, or what the purpose would be? So that helps me a little bit. Okay,
and I mean, I'm sure you can imagine there's lots of interest from the field about what our work is including right now.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, thank you, Emily. That helps me try to explain that. All right, so it is time for public comment. And so I do want to first allow Tristan to read to us the email that she received. And we do have some members in the audience that also want to share. I see Dennis has got his hand raised. So if we could first go to Tristan to read the if you will, the email that you received, and then we'll go to Dennis and anyone else who is in our public that wants to share for 3 minutes. Go ahead, Tristan. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. So I received this email from Flo Kewell in Columbia Falls, and I'm just going to read what she sent me. She says, I have struggled to decide on what comments I want to make. There are so many things, but I think the most important thing is that our public school system has a pervasive culture of negativity towards parents. I have seen this both personally and professionally over the past 35 years. I have heard negativity from teachers at kindergarten level all the way up to the college level. This negativity includes parents that are the cause of child problems at schools. These people are lousy parents. They should be doing this or that. Parents think we're babysitters. Parents are incapable of teaching their children anything. Parents don't know anything about curriculum or teaching. Parents just need to trust us and do what we tell them. Parents want special services. We need to give minimal services. It's the parents' fault. Parents are the enemy. She says, I get it. I would not want to teach in a classroom of 20 children and have to deal with 40 plus parents, but this attitude is completely unacceptable. Parents are the customers. Parents are the decision makers in this child's life. Teachers need to show some respect and listen to what the parent has to say. If you think parents don't know what the teachers really think about their parents, do you think the teacher's attitude doesn't have an effect on the child and how he perceives his family? Expect teachers to show respect for parents, both in person and behind their backs. Stop the complaining and gossiping about parents between teachers. Allow parents to truly be partners in the education process, not just aides for the teachers. That is it. All right, Dennis, I'm gonna allow you to talk here.
Thank you. I just have 3 quick points. Accreditation standards in Montana have historically been considered to be minimum standards of quality. And I'm not convinced that questions like how do you determine if a school is successful aligns with this perspective or helps the task force move in that direction. But I am heartened. It appears that your homework exercises may provide an opportunity for the task force to set their direction that they will use to filter changes that will come forward. Secondly, I believe there's a balance that must be kept in mind, that the constitutional authority of both the Board of Public Education and locally elected trustees is that balance that needs to be considered. And finally, I'm also concerned about the survey that's put out for public input. It could possibly be compromised by one of many constituencies that could rally like-minded individuals and provide their collective input based on their particular beliefs. And really the only way to avoid that is a third-party implementation of a public survey to ensure that that doesn't happen. Thank you. Appreciate your time.
All right, thank you, Dennis. Next, we have Diane. I will allow you to talk here.
Thank you. For the record, Diane Fladmo, Director of Public Policy for the Montana Federation of Public Employees. We represent thousands of teachers and paraeducators and many others, support staff working in schools, and we're privileged to do that. I would have to just make a few points, and one is to echo having ease of access to the Chapter 55 committee's information. Without that, it's very difficult to be able to follow what is happening and to be a strong participant. And although I greatly value the folks that are on the task force, of course, I know that there is a small representation of school employees, and I want to do the best work that we can, both so that I, as well as others interested in the work of the task force and the material that's being used, I just would urge you to post that in a readily available place for the public to access. I agree with earlier comments that the survey would be best accomplished through a third-party firm, since it is very difficult to get the information out, and it could be not as useful as it might be without the clear methodology that should be used and promoted. And finally, I'll just make a comment that from the previous note or the email that was read about teachers not valuing parents. And I certainly would welcome any type of exchange I could have with the individual writing in the letter. I don't know if that will happen, but I, as a former educator myself and representing educators, I will just say that I know teachers are valued. Teachers value and respect parents and do understand the challenges that come with being a parent. And I would urge that same understanding be extended to those who are actively involved in schools, whether working as a teacher or a support staff member, an administrator, or a school board member. We're all working together during a very difficult time. And I appreciate the points being raised, and just want to say that I'm hoping that we all can work together to be a part of the solution, to encourage better and more open communication among all of the many interests that are present in the operation of our public schools. Lastly, thank you to the task force for your work. And I hope to be able to see you in person in March. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Do we have any additional public comment? You can raise your hand if you'd like to speak. I am not seeing any, Julie.
Okay, thank you, Tristan, so much. Much appreciated. So that brings us, you guys, to a close of our virtual session. We look forward to seeing you all on March 8th in the Capitol here in Helena. I do look forward to getting out to you information about your reading. Be sure you take a look at that. We'll post your homework, but please review those documents and submit your ideas around what conceptual changes we should be considering when we come together. Because when we do meet on the 8th and 9th, that'll be our work, really, is for us to begin to map those out and begin to start kind of redlining and making recommendations around those rules. So appreciate any insight that you can give, so I can be sure that you have the right mix of expertise there and available and resources, so that you can come together as a group and begin your second deliverable. I thank you from the Office of Public Instruction for all your work in this month of February. It's coming to a close here at the end of the week. So thank you all. If you have any questions or need any help, please do not hesitate reaching out to Tristan and I. We're here to help you make this process the best that it can be. Thank you, guys.